How are you, Lisa? It is very nice to see you again.
Hey Azoria. It's good to see you too. I thought I was going to get here before you.
I believe we both got here at the same time.
Yes. I believe so too.
Well, are you ready for the next part of the adventure?
Yes, I am. I have been thinking about it since the other night.
Awesome. Let's go across the street and get ourselves a table. And I will tell you the rest of Chapter 1. What do you think?
Sounds good. Let's do it. Are you ready?
Yes, I am. So, where did we leave the story last time?
I believe it was the part when you introduce another one of the main characters of the story. The little girl.
Correct!
She was crying after having a nightmare. And then her mother came to her side to console her.
Exactly. That little girl is Laura. She plays a pivotal role in the story.
That's what I remember. Very well then. Start from where you ended it the last time. But get into character first.
You got it. Here it goes. Greetings, friends. Welcome back. Last we were here, we were reaching the conclusion of Chapter 1. Uninformed Casualties. I was telling you about little Laura's mother, Susan, coming to console her. When Laura had suddenly waken up screaming, Susan embraced her tightly and stroked her silky black hair. She attempted to make her daughter feel better, but Laura could not stop crying. She was shaking from fear. David, too, was shivering and afraid. His arms were covered with goosebumps. Susan noticed it and approached him while carrying Laura in her arms. She lightly touched his arm to get his attention. Dios mío, David. Estás frisado. My goodness, David, you are freezing. Are you okay? Susan said, in Spanish, as she continued stroking Laura's hair reassuringly. She could not attend to her son at that particular moment, because little Laura would not stop crying, nor could she erase the look of fear from her eyes. David looked at his mother and little sister for a moment. Susan was trying to reach for the children's blanket on their bed. As he watched her, he slowly trenched himself against a corner of the room and placed his arms over his head.
So sad. Poor little kids.
Susan was holding the blanket in her hand. David lifted his head slowly. He looked at the dark corner of the wall behind his and his sister's bed, as his mother came back to cover him with the blanket. His head was under his arms again. David, ¿estás bien? David, are you feeling okay? Susan asked, after placing the blanket over David's shoulders. She then caressed his forehead, while doing the same to Laura's back. Mommy, ¿puedo dormir en tu cama, por favor? Mommy, can I sleep in your bed, please? The little girl whispered. Yes, my dear, Susan replied, while removing Laura from her shoulder and placing her on the bed. The little girl seemed more relaxed as Susan looked at her face. David quickly stood up and also asked to be taken to his mother's bed. Susan agreed. The children moved their pillows over to their mother's bed, which was only 3 steps away from theirs. Laura looked over her mother's shoulder. At the far corner, behind hers, and her brother's bed, she saw something move in the shadows. Whatever she saw, it frightened her, prompting her to bury her face against her mother's neck and hug her tightly. Susan placed both children in her bed and sang to them their favorite lullaby. She waited and watched as they both fell asleep again. Susan looked around the room momentarily. She didn't know what she was looking for. Her eyes ended up gazing upon Laura, staring at her innocent face. Finally sleeping like a little angel, her eyes slowly gravitated towards David. He was holding Laura's hand as he slept. Susan then took a deep breath. She was exhausted but could not bring herself to sleep. When she noticed her children were shivering, and then tossing and turning, she covered them both with her blanket, embraced them, and continued watching them sleep, until she saw the sun rising through the shutters of her bedroom window. It was still early in the morning and those people, belonging to the lowest of class status of society, not yet enjoying the partial economic boom the country was beginning to experience, thanks in part to new international investors, could be seen gathering by the forest, near the areas of a lake, where some washed their clothing, and others bathed and cleansed their bodies, and picked up water to take back to their homes. A different group of people was seen on the other side of the lake, men, women and children as well. They were gypsies. Their particular mannerisms, the way they dressed and carried themselves, they really stood out from the town locals. They looked strange and unfamiliar to those who were already used to practicing their daily routine in that part of town. They stared at each other with curiosity before the strangers continued their walk through the trail, which was leading them into the deeper parts of the woods. Elsewhere, near the center of Tarrazú, a town in the city of Alajuela, which was to the north of San Jose, the capital of Costa Rica, Ramon, a man in his early 20s, had just pulled up in his white, two-door, short cabin, pickup truck. He stopped right in front of a newly developed plaza. Ramon took a second to notice the newly modernized apartment buildings and storefronts. For those who could afford them, a new supermarket, a hardware store, a new and fancy-looking hotel, a doctor's office, as well as other, well-appointed variety stores and restaurants. It gave the location a modern, well-planned, and sophisticated look. Ramon had been dusting his blue jeans, realizing there was a hole on the left side of his gray t-shirt. He began bringing out several boxes out from the back of the truck and placing them at the entrance of the doctor's office located on the second floor. A young man named Luis came down from the doctor's office. He was short and skinny, and had come down to offer Ramon a hand with the boxes. "You're going to need a haircut soon, Ramon," Luis said. "What, really?" Ramon replied. "Just kidding, guy," Luis added. "Don't take it so seriously." Ramon looked at him. "Luis, ¿qué te pasa? What is wrong with you? Don't be stupid," Ramon said to Luis. With a smile and a smirk on his face, Ramon looked at his reflection on the glass window of his truck and indeed noticed that his hair has grown out and was beginning to look shaggy. Meanwhile, Luis went on to take a dose from his inhaler to control his asthma condition before he began picking up boxes. Ramon knew Luis through past odd jobs that they had done together at the shipyard, where they had worked for a Russian company. When they finished bringing up all the boxes of supplies to the doctor's office, Ramon was on his way downstairs. He accidentally took a misstep and fell backwards on the steps, hitting the back of his head very hard. Luis and one of the nurses, who was taking a coffee break outside the doctor's office, came rushing over to Ramon. They helped him up. She checked him over quickly and Luis asked him if he was okay. The nurse ran to bring a glass of water. She also brought the doctor back with her to quickly have a look. They rushed over to Ramon's side. The doctor checked Ramon's head for any outside injuries and checked to see if Ramon's vitals, awareness, and reflexes were all fine. Ramon told him that he was feeling all right, and that nothing happened that required so much attention. "I just took a misstep and threw myself down so I did not mess up my ankle," Ramon said to the doctor. "I see then." "Okay," the doctor said, feeling more at ease.
Just stay sitting down for a few more minutes, just in case. You are not bleeding or anything, but if you feel dizzy or faint, it can be something more serious. If that happens, make sure you get help right away,"
the doctor ordered before heading back to his office. A little while later, Ramon was back on his feet. After splashing the last bit of water over his face, he calmly walked down the stairs. Although he did not want to admit it, he was still not feeling well. His head was still throbbing and hurting, and he was having some trouble breathing. But he was a stubborn and proud young man. He could not bring himself to admit to others that he hit himself hard as he fell, because he did not want anyone to fuss over him. As he was about to walk outside the door, the glare of the sunlight bothered his eyes. He saw sparks, bright strings and flashes of light in the air, all around him, and it was all making him feel dizzy. He had to cover his eyes for a moment before being able to see clearly enough to step out onto the sidewalk. Ramon was feeling lightheaded and had shortness of breath. These symptoms amounted to a moment of weakness, prompting him to lean against the wall for support. He looked in all directions to make sure no one saw him in this condition. After a few seconds of deep breathing, he began to feel slightly better. He looked back and did not see anyone coming down from the second floor. He then took a few steps down and walked outside, while looking across the street, where he saw the blurry image of a man. After staring at that man for a few seconds, a thought had come to his mind. Maybe it was the man's appearance, or maybe the strange way the man was behaving. But Ramon knew for sure, he had not seen him around the area before. Ramon continued to follow the man with his eyes. Then, for a second or two, he lost sight of the strange man. Ramon rubbed his right eye with his hand. He immediately regained a partial sight of the man. Ramon saw him walking back and forth across the street. Maybe the man is homeless, Ramon thought, by the looks of his dirty long hair and tattered clothes, his unshaven face and his overall unkempt look. But something else gave Ramon a weird vibe about him. Ramon continued observing as the man walked after some people who walked by him. He stared as the homeless man continued following some of the people who walked past him, panhandling, talking, and even trying to tap some of them on their shoulders. But everyone was ignoring him. Not one person acknowledged anything he said or did, disregarding him as if he was not even there. Ramon put his left hand into his left front pocket and pulled out the money he had just been paid for delivering the supplies to the doctor's office. He held it in his hands for a few seconds before putting it back inside his pocket, while never taking his eyes away from the man across the street. Then, he turns his face to look at some of the people coming out of the grocery store next door, as well as others crossing the street. Ramon plunged his right hand into the right side pocket of his pants, where he kept his black hair comb, a piece of paper with several phone numbers, as well as a little cash. He pulled out 3 notes and decided to walk across the street towards the stranger. At the same time, Susan was walking across the street with Laura and David. Ramon spotted them and recognized the children's mother from the last time she was at the doctor's office. The little girl is sick again? Ramon thought to himself, while walking and staring at Laura and her family. His and Susan's eyes met for a second, and he smiled at her and the children as they walked by him. Ramon then began refocusing his sight in the direction of where the homeless man was stumbling around. For a moment, Ramon could not see where the man was, and so he began looking around. His head was still hurting, and he took several steps back to the sidewalk in order to close his eyes and catch his breath. He then looked across the street one more time, where he spotted the strange man, now standing near the corner. And after 2 seconds, he decided to head near him. Walking across the street, Ramon noticed that the man was looking in his direction as he continued walking towards him. But then, he soon realized that the man was not looking at him, but past him. Ramon turned his head to see what he was looking at. He didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, and so, he continued crossing the street. As he got closer to him, Ramon noticed something strange. To his surprise, the homeless man did not smell bad like he thought he would. In fact, he did not smell like anything at all. "Hey!" Ramon greeted the homeless man. The homeless man looked at Ramon very surprised. He appeared almost shocked that Ramon was actually addressing him. "Here, this is for you," Ramon said to the homeless man, extending his hand towards him with the cash in it. The man stared at Ramon in the eyes without paying any attention to the money he was being given. He then set his sight towards the doctor's office before taking a last look back at Ramon. Ramon was still looking at the man's face, but for some reason, his vision became momentarily blurry, and he could not clearly see his exact appearance.
Who are you? How?
The man whispered while staring at Ramon curiously. "Here man, take this. It's for you," Ramon again said, trying to give some money to the supposed homeless man. The man did not appear interested in the money at all, but only seemed rather surprised that Ramon was trying to talk to him. A few awkward seconds passed between the two of them. The homeless man suddenly snatched the money away from Ramon's hand and took a few steps back, murmuring something, while again looking towards the entrance to the medical office. Ramon stared oddly as someone walked by his side, and the homeless man attempted to approach them to say something to them. But as with the others before, he was being ignored. Ramon thought that there was something very odd about the guy, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Besides the fact that he was not from the area, his appearance and behavior were both strange and uneasy. "Ah!" Ramon cried out, startled. A very loud horn blasted right next to his face, as a truck rolled right past him, barely missing him by an inch of his hair. "Oh no!" he said to himself before he looked back towards the sidewalk. "Oh God!" he exclaimed, seeing other vehicles fast coming his way. After realizing that, at that moment, he was standing in the middle of the busy street. Where, what, and how in the world? Ramon wondered how. He had gone to the middle of the street. It took him a moment, but he then ran, as fast as he could, towards the other sidewalk. And as he looked in the opposite direction, he noticed the homeless man walking away from him. What the hell? How did I end up there? Ramon again asked himself. He had no idea of what had occurred, but walked over to his truck. While pondering about it, he placed his right hand over the door handle, but he did not open the door. He looked again at the direction the homeless man had taken, to see if he turned to look at him. The homeless man was still walking back towards the other corner, and did not look back towards Ramon's. "Hey, Ramon!" Ramon heard someone shouting his name. "What?" he reacted, while turning his head, to see Luis, running towards him with urgency, from the entrance of the doctor's office. Luis stopped running as he got near Ramon's truck. He had to catch his breath before placing his inhaler in his mouth. Ramon stared at him as he did, but he also looked across the street again. There was something of concern in his mind. Luis then placed the inhaler back inside his pocket while staring at Ramon oddly. "Are you okay, man?" Luis asked, nearing closer to Ramon to pat him over the right shoulder. "What do you mean, Luis?" Ramon asked. "What were you thinking, man?" Luis replied. "You almost got run over by that truck." Ramon was surprised with what he was hearing from Luis, since he himself could not remember how he ended up in the middle of the street and in the path of that truck. "That stupid idiot didn't see me. That's what happened." Ramon quickly defended himself. "Whatever you say, man, but that was too close to be funny, if you ask me." Luis added with a nervous laugh. "Do you need me to come with you tomorrow?" he then asked Ramon. "Sure, Luis. You can come if you like." Ramon agreed to the idea. Luis was very happy to hear that. This would allow him to earn some extra cash. "Hey, Ramon." Luis turned his face and looked across the street, while again walking closer to Ramon. "What was it that you went to get across the street? And who was that person chatting with you?" Ramon thought about the question, but he found it very strange that he did not remember even having chat with anyone. "What are you talking about?" Ramon replied. "What do you mean with that?" Luis asked, surprised. "The guy was saying something to you," he said to Ramon. "Luis, no one said anything to me," Ramon reiterated. "Yes, Ramon. That weird guy said something to you," Luis repeated, expressing confusion about Ramon's answer. "Because," Luis continued, "I was near the window in the doctor's office, and I heard you. After you said something to him, you went back walking across the street, and he followed you and got close to you. He was almost wrapping his arms around you. That's why I asked you, because he appeared to have been telling you something in your ear. Then he walked away from you. I turned my eyes away for 1 second, and when I looked again, I see you almost getting hit by a truck." At that moment, Ramon did not know what to think. He took a quick look at the other side of the street as he walked into his truck. He also looked through his rearview mirror, but there were no more sightings of the homeless man. Luis was staring at him oddly. Ramon noticed it. "Luis, go home. I will see you tomorrow," Ramon said, while still looking around. "Okay, man, see you tomorrow." Luis waved goodbye as he walked away, while again placing the inhaler in his mouth. Ramon stared at his friend and thought about what he had just said to him. He attempted to remember the timeline from when he walked up to the homeless man, and the time Luis was talking about, but he could not remember anything in between. So how can it be? Ramon thought. How did Luis see something that I can't remember doing a few minutes ago? And how did I end up almost hit by a truck in the middle of the street? What's wrong with me? What the hell did Luis just tell me? As Ramon turned the truck on, after deciding that it was time for him to go and get some rest, Clarence and Helena were making their way out of a very crowded minibus, which made us stop at a corner away from where the doctor's office was located. Helena had brought Clarence to show him one of her favorite parts of town. and a particular place she would only come to visit on her own. It took them a moment to make it out of the very crowded vehicle, with Clarence walking behind Helena to offer her shelter from all of the undesirable stares and catcalls she was being bombarded with from many of the men who stayed behind in the minibus. This included the driver and his assistant, who got reprimanded for his inappropriate comment by a pair of middle-aged ladies traveling in the back of the vehicle. "Helena, does this happen to you everywhere you go?" Clarence asked, in a cautious and curious tone of voice. Helena smiled and took hold of his hand to speed up his steps. Clarence smiled back at her while taking notice of the change in the atmosphere and people's demographics in this part of town, in comparison to where he was staying at the time, which was a cheap, old hotel at the other side of town. As he and Helena paced together, they soon became part of the blend of that atmosphere themselves.
Were they on a date?
"I don't know, Lisa. You need to continue listening."
Okay. Continued then. I won't interrupt you again.
"No worries. Feel free to ask me questions when you feel you need additional detail of the story."
Okay. I will.
"Okay, then back into character." As I was saying, in the meantime, in the waiting room of the doctor's office, Laura looked very drained as she and her family waited for their turn to be seen by the doctor. "Would you like to be carried?" Susan asked her. "Yes, Mommy," Laura replied. "David, can you please hold these for a moment?" Susan asked David to hold on to their bags, which contained snacks and extra clothing for both he and his sister. The waiting room was not big enough and it was very crowded at the time. Susan did not want to misplace the children's things or mix them with anyone else's. She picked up Laura in her arms and Laura rested her head on her mother's shoulder. One of the doctor's assistants saw the family from the window at her desk. She walked back to one of the exam rooms to tell the doctor that Laura was back. "Mommy, I'm very tired," Laura whispered into her mother's ear. Her voice sounded fragile and her skin looked very pale. There were also dark circles under her innocent eyes. "Mom, are you okay?" David asked, looking up at his mother. "It's all right, honey, I'm fine," Susan sounded tenderly in her reply. But she struggled while carrying Laura. She hadn't been able to sleep the night before, and it had been the fourth night in a row that she was not able to, because of Laura's nightmares. Laura had already fallen asleep as Susan spoke to the doctor's assistant. Susan was able to find an empty seat nearby and sat down with Laura in her lap, fast asleep. The person Susan had been talking to went back to help the doctor as the head assistant came out to talk to Susan. "Hello, Susan," the head assistant said. "Hi Margot, how are you?" Susan replied, forcing a smile. Margot told her she was going to be back with the papers she needed to fill out for this visit. She returned shortly and began asking some questions about Laura. "Is she showing any improvement?" Margot asked Susan, while handing her the forms. "She really hasn't been eating, and she is also experiencing more and more nightmares lately," Susan replied. "I'm really worried about her, Margot." Margot had noticed that Susan herself looked extremely tired and had dark circles around her eyes. "Are you well? Have you been sleeping normally?" Margot asked in a kind voice. Susan just smiled and nodded. David was playing with a toy he found along the side of some books at the bottom of a small cabinet. Susan and David looked up at the entrance door when they saw it closing back on its own. They did not remember it being open. Susan then continued to fill out the forms she was given. David went back to playing with a toy as Laura slept. Margot handed Susan a glass of water. "Here, drink this." "This cannot be good," Margot thought to herself, while staring at Susan drinking the water. Susan took only a sip, and then began telling Margot about Laura. She had a really bad episode last night. "I hope Dr. Marco will see her soon." An elderly lady was exiting one of the rooms as Margot and Susan spoke. Susan noticed that she looked upset and was trying to be discreet about her emotions. One of the doctor's assistants followed the lady out of the room and walked with her to help her down the steps.
"What's wrong, Mrs. Fontaine?" "No, there is nothing wrong. I just... want to go home. Now.
The doctor then walked out of the room and another assistant followed him. He waved hello to Susan as he made his way into his private office. Dr. Marco was in his late 30s. He was fairly tall and slim, with dark hair combed forward. He had built a thriving business with help from his connections in the local government. This enabled him to develop a large clientele, where his patients ranged from children to adults, and even the elderly. It all helped him to become a trusted and well-respected leader in his community. Susan noticed a preoccupation on his face. Carla, one of the assistants, was a lady in her early 50s. She approached Susan and asked her if Laura was feeling sick again. Susan responded by telling her about the tumultuous night her daughter had the night before. As Susan continued conversing with Miss Carla, she failed to notice that the elderly lady being escorted out was profoundly staring at Laura. Laura opened her eyes and happened to look right into the lady's eyes. At that moment, the elderly woman felt a strange sensation, which Laura reciprocated. The lady looked around the room momentarily, as if looking for something in it. She seemed to have wanted to say something but then decided to keep it to herself. She then calmly turned her face away from the little girl. "Let's get going, Mrs. Fontaine. Your taxi is waiting downstairs." The assistant escorted the lady down the stairs as Laura continued to watch her walk away. "Is there anything wrong, Mrs. Fontaine?" the assistant asked. "No. But you can let my arm go. I am okay on my own," she replied. The assistant noticed that she was shaking and hesitated to let go of Mrs. Fontaine's arm, but she gently pulled her arm away from the assistant's hand anyway. She walked out of the building and took one last look back, remembering the look in Laura's eyes. For some reason, it reminded her of something disturbing, a memory from long ago. One which she had intentionally buried away within the deepest regions of her mind. Sometime later, Laura and David walked out of the doctor's office towards the sidewalk, followed by Susan and Dr. Marco.
"I do not believe it is prudent for you to overreact, my dear,"
Dr. Marco said to Susan, as they both watched Laura and David playing only a few feet away from them.
"Little Laura is just overcoming a mild case of allergies, and we shall allow more time for the treatment we started 2 weeks ago to start bearing results with her migraine headaches. She is just too young to be prescribed any other treatment method for the time being. It is best to allow her body to develop more strength on its own, and we will continue observing her to see how she assimilates to this new approach."
Susan had her doubts about the cause of Laura's nightmares and sudden illness, but at the same time, there was nothing she could do but to continue with the treatment and pray for the best.
"Susan, I understand you have enough on your plate with Laura's condition, but you also need to pay close attention to David,"
the doctor also added. Susan explained to him that David was very used to doing things with his father and eating was one of those things. "But now that my husband is away for work," Susan continued, "it has become more of a challenge for me to be able to make David eat appropriately, especially with Laura's problems getting worse." Dr. Marco seemed to agree with Susan.
"I know. I fully understand. My children are the same way,"
Dr. Marco said.
"But in all cases, do not hesitate to contact our office if you have any questions or if anything unusual should arise with the children."
The doctor was very kind and reassuring to Susan. She felt that he really cared about the well-being of her children. He also reminded her to get the new prescription for Laura before advising her to give the children warm milk before their bedtime, to help them sleep better. Susan again thanked him for his help and his advice, before she told the children to say goodbye to their doctor. Dr. Marco waved goodbye to the children as the family made their way to the bus stop. The doctor remained staring at them from where he was, his hands inside his lab coat pockets as his eyes continued studying Laura. As she walked away holding her mother's hand, he was very concerned about the little girl and submerged deep in thought. His experience was signaling to his better judgment that there was probably an underlying condition with Laura, a problem to which conventional medicine would not be the solution. It was something which he could not yet figure out but needed and wanted to continue investigating. And this will be the official end of Chapter 1, Lisa.
Oh no. Is this episode over already? I was really getting into the story. What happens to the kids? And what was the homeless man really up to? Is this where Helena and Clarence fall in love? Can you tell me a little bit about Chapter 2? Just a tiny bit.
Lisa, I will tell you everything about Chapter 2. But you will have to wait until the next episode. It will not be too long. I promise. For now, let us order some lunch. And wait until episode 3.
Okay then. Till next episode.